Good morning and welcome to today's discussion, Mexico at the Crossroads, Navigating U.S.-China Tensions. I'm Leila Abed, Director of the Mexico Program, and on behalf of the Inter-American Dialogue, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for what promises to be a very timely and thought-provoking conversation. We gather at a moment of intensifying global and regional complexity. The relationship between the United States and China continues to define much of the international economic and strategic landscape, and Mexico, as both a key U.S. trading partner and a rapidly expanding manufacturing hub, now finds itself squarely in the middle of these tensions. In recent years, the United States has grown increasingly concerned that Mexico may be serving as a backdoor for Chinese investment and for Chinese companies seeking to circumvent U.S. tariffs. This has made Chinese economic activity in Mexico not just a trade issue, but also a matter of national security for the United States. At the same time, China's growing footprint in Mexico, from industrial parks and auto manufacturing to electronics and logistics, has created both opportunities and risks. It offers Mexico access to capital and technology, but as mentioned, it also exposes a country to heightened scrutiny and geopolitical sensitivities from its northern neighbor. This debate will obviously only intensify in the months ahead as China looms large in the backdrop of the USMCA review process. For the United States, the goal is to ensure that its trade interests are protected, all while preserving the spirit of North American integration, and that the agreement is not used to channel non-compliant goods or investment from outside the region. For Mexico, the challenge is to balance its economic diversification efforts with its deep and strategic ties to the United States and Canada. President Claudia Sheinbaum has made clear that she intends to navigate this balance carefully and has sent direct signs to Washington that she understands that Chinese investment in Mexico poses a real concern. Her 6-year industrial development blueprint, known as Plan Mexico, calls for reducing imports from Asia, increasing national content in production, and promoting greater regional integration within North America. She has also pledged to uphold and strengthen the USMCA framework, signaling continuity and a commitment to North American competitiveness. In addition, the Mexican government has also imposed tariffs on thousands of Chinese products, a move widely seen as a response to U.S. pressure and a reflection of growing awareness in Mexico City of the geopolitical dimensions of trade policy. Our distinguished panel of experts today will explore these complex dynamics in greater depth. They will assess the scope and implications of China's expanding economic presence in Mexico, discuss how it affects U.S.-Mexico relations, and consider what it means for the broader regional architecture of North America. I now have the great pleasure of introducing our moderator, Juan Pablo Spinetto. Juan Pablo is an opinion columnist at Bloomberg, where he covers Latin American business, economic affairs, and politics from Mexico City. Prior to this, Spinetto was managing editor for Latin American economics and government at Bloomberg News. Over his 20-year career at Bloomberg, he has also held positions including multimedia projects and covering the commodities industries in Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro, and London. But before I turn it over to our wonderful moderator, I want to take this time to thank you again for joining us this morning, and our deepest gratitude to our wonderful speakers for sharing their knowledge and insights with our audience. And with that, over to you, JP. Thank you for moderating today's conversation.
Thank you, Leila, and happy Friday, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I think, as you said, Leila, I write about LATAM as a job. And one of the biggest issues that we have this year, one of the key stories was the relationship of China within Mexico and the USMCA. This is in my opinion, Mexico is one of the biggest front of the U.S.-China rivalry, and we are seeing it. We are seeing it with all the measures that the Mexican government has taken this year to try to diminish the presence of Chinese investment in the country. So I'm very excited about having this fantastic group of experts to talk about this issue for the next hour and 15 minutes. I'm joined by Margaret Meyer. She is a senior advisor for Asia, Latin America, for the Asian and Latin American program at the Inter-American Dialogue. Hello, Margaret, how are you? I'm also joined by Sergio Luna. He is the chief economist for Grupo Financiero Mifel here in Mexico City. Sergio?
Hi, nice to be here.
And also by Beatriz Leisegui Gardoki. She is a partner at the SAI Derecho and Economía consultancy firm. She's an expert on international trade and a former official of the Mexican government. So, Beatriz, hello, how are you? It's great to have you, and
Thank you,
that you give
Juanpa.
us a bit of insights from someone who was in the room in these tough negotiations. So let me start with you, Margaret, because you've been writing extensively in the past years about how China is changing its strategy for Latin America. And I wonder if you can explain what that means and also how the tailoring of the strategy impacts Mexico.
Absolutely. I mean, Mexico is something of an outlier in the overall China-Latin America dynamic, in part because so much of the focus is on manufacturing. However, we do see a lot of the same trends happening globally in terms of Chinese engagement that we do in the Mexican context. One of these critical trends is a sort of, we call it a tapering of economic engagement, right? So we aren't seeing the same numbers these days, right, in terms of foreign direct investment that we have seen even in recent years. There is something of a decline in the overall amount of foreign direct investment. That's consistent with what's happening globally and indeed across the Latin American region. However, at the same time, we are seeing a focusing of effort on very specific sectors that are directly aligned with China's economic growth objectives. And indeed, manufacturing, high-end manufacturing in particular, is a very big part of these areas of focus that have been identified by China, both as an effort to increase productivity, to become very competitive in these dynamic and emerging industries, but also to offload certain sorts of excess capacity, whether it be in electric vehicles, in renewable energy, or in steel for that matter. A lot of the things that are being exported are essentially indirect exportation of steel production, wherein China maintains a considerable degree of excess capacity. So there's that as well. And then the other trend that we see, generally speaking, in the region is one of localization. That's something where a lot of deals, in other words, are being made at the local level, and certainly that's a major story in Mexico, as it is in many other federalized systems of governance, right? So Brazil, Argentina, you see this to a degree in Chile as well, where so much of the decision making, a lot of the deal making is made at the local level, and indeed that's impactful in terms of monitoring, in terms of figuring out certain trends. And certainly, China has made considerable progress and inroads through negotiations at the state level in Mexico in particular. I won't, we can go into this in a little bit, JP, because I'm cognizant of everyone else having a moment to speak, but I do want to mention that, in the Mexico context in particular, there are sort of three parallel stories ongoing, right? In addition to all of this broader dynamic, right, of tapering, of localization, and of focusing on specific sectors, there are three kind of trends that we see emerging in FDI, and I'm happy to address those in a moment.
Perfect, and we need to talk about autos as well. So you actually touch on the FDI figures, and I think at some point I would like to discuss, how real these figures are, because there is a lot of controversy around it. But let me first turn to Sergio. Can you give us the macro perspective of China in Mexico? Because I don't think there are too many countries with this particular trade framework that Mexico has with China, where it exports only a tiny bit and imports a massive amount of goods. But Sergio, can you give us the outline?
Yes, thank you very much, Juan Pablo. Actually, I think that that has to sort of frame the discussion, and probably what we're going to be seeing in terms of the debate regarding USMCA next year, in the sense that when you think about the market share of Mexico and China in the U.S. import market, I think that you can distinguish very clearly several stages on the way that our relationship has been evolving. The 1990s were sort of the NAFTA bliss period, in which we had in Mexico the U.S. market for ourselves, given the advantage provided by the drop in tariffs driven by the NAFTA agreement, and that was the time when we finally reached double-digit level of market share in the U.S. import market. But obviously, the threat of China was looming as it joined the WTO in 2001. It is important to remember that Mexico was the last country to authorize China entering into the WTI, and we negotiate a very, I'm sure that Beatriz can tell us more about it, but we negotiate a longer period in terms of being able to apply countervailing duties in order to protect our markets. But certainly the main goal was to try to keep our presence in the U.S. market, and actually our fears were materialized by the fact that our market share in the U.S. import market just rose from around 11% to 13% towards 2016, whereas in the case of China, it went from around 9% to 21%. So obviously in that regard, it was a very hard time until we had the first Trump administration, which obviously, imposed these tariffs on around 1/3 of Chinese product in the first period of President Trump. And then we saw a major drop in the share of China in the U.S. import market from 21% to around 13%. And we had a bit of a gain ourselves to levels of around 15%. But the important thing, Juan Pablo, is that during this period, we saw that the share of China in Mexican imports rose from around 2% at the beginning of the century to around 20% nowadays. So what we thought that, after the Trump administration, the first Trump administration came into power, would be sort of a mechanism of trade deviation, actually became a sort of trade triangulation, in the sense that Mexico became a platform for Chinese production to access the U.S. market. And in that regard, I think that's something that's going to be critical in the discussion of USMCA next year, is how we can sort of guarantee that we don't have these leakages outside of the region. And in that regard, and this is sort of a bold proposal, but actually the American Steel Institute is already talking about a common tariff for the whole North American region, which of course is the first stage of a custom union. And it's probably worth remembering that that was the origin of the European Union in the 1950s. The curious thing is that when I had talked to some people in Mexico that possibility, people do not react as it is a bad idea. So I just leave this proposal on the table because I'm sure it's going to be controversial and a source of a lot of discussion here.
It is indeed very controversial, right? Because at the same time, you will say, why I have to tie my fate to what the U.S. does, right? Especially with all the movements in Washington. But Beatriz, Sergio talked about the first Trump administration, the imposing of tariffs, and obviously we have these new rounds of tariffs with Trump too. How are these tariffs in the U.S. affecting Mexico?
Yes. Let me just, if I may, Juan Pablo, follow up on what Sergio just mentioned that is very critical and very important.
Yes.
That has to do with precisely these, the reaction of Trump to Chinese trade in general in his first term under Trump 1.0. It reacted and it reacted unilaterally in the world. It was the only country that imposed these type of measures against China, and the rest of the world continued importing from China, transforming the products and sending them to the U.S. And they did not do it necessarily illegally, as it's, because the free trade agreements provide that if the input is introduced into the country and transformed and it meets a rule of origin, it can go into the U.S. with zero tariff. And at the same time, the U.S. had a very open economy in which most countries could export final goods or whatever goods to the U.S. without paying any tariff. So that occurred, and so the U.S. producers were put as, and Sergio has mentioned the steel sector, but there were many other sectors and many other producers that were hurt because they had to pay nearly, now it's almost 10 years of paying these tariffs when, you know, for the inputs they use from China, and the rest of the world didn't. So this is a structural problem that Mexico has to address seriously during this process that we are now first negotiating with the US to see how we can eliminate or at least be relatively better off than the rest of the world with the unilateral tariffs that the US has imposed. And so now I go and address your specific question. And I think this is very important for Mexico because under the prior stages, Mexico had more or less equal footing, you know, competed in the US market in equal terms because it was an open market. Now that it isn't, who's better off with the tariffs is extremely important. And Mexico has been, it has faced tariffs of 25% for all those goods that are exported to the U.S. outside of the USMCA. This is not complying with the rule of origin. And while in the past, because the U.S. was such an open economy, 50% of Mexico's exports were outside of NAFTA, not under NAFTA. Today, after that 25% tariff, fentanyl and migration tariff that was imposed to Mexico has been in place, 84% of Mexico's exports, according to data from the Ministry of Economy, now comply with the rule of origin and are being exported with zero tariff, because that's something that the agreement has played in our favor during these times. So that has been important. However, it's calculated that 1/3 of North America's trade is being affected by the sectorial tariffs that have been imposed in many final goods and inputs by the U.S. under Section 232 of the Trade Expansions Act, and so that Mexico is facing 50% tariffs in steel, in the autos and the auto parts, in copper, in aluminum. It's facing very high tariffs, and those are many times inputs that are used in Mexico's final products. And so even though they have a 0% tariff, for example, beer has 0% tariff, it has to pay a tariff because of aluminum, because of tariff on aluminum. So that's how we are. Fortunately, Mexico has been in truces where it has been expected that 25% tariff would be increased to 30%. Recently, the U.S. decided to postpone that entry of that tariff for now an undetermined period of time, and that's where we are at this moment.
Yeah, for being a free trade zone, we have a lot of tariffs for sure at the moment. Let me go back to you, Margaret, and ask you something that Sergio was mentioning. And if we see the stats that he was mentioning, the growing presence of Chinese suppliers in Mexico's production is quite obvious. Mexico imports about $130 billion every year from China. A lot of them are intermediate goods. But what is the evidence that all these goods end in the US as the Trump administration argues?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think, clearly the stories differ across industries, right? There are those where there may indeed be some efforts to circumvent tariffs in order to engage more extensively with the U.S. market. And then there are others where really the market that is being sought is a Mexican market, right, or other markets, and so it really does matter what industry we are talking about. We were fortunate to do a study on the auto industry very recently called China's Presence in Mexico's Auto Sector: What's at Stake for Mexico. And there in particular, I mean, it's a very complex story. It's one that, first of all, getting the data, right, can be enormously challenging. But once you do, you begin to realize that there are a lot of different things happening, and you need to kind of distinguish these different stories from one another. So the story that we hear, right, often is one of booming investment across the board in Mexico in the auto sector, right? And mention of major investments by BYD, for instance, and other major auto manufacturers. That story, right, of actual manufacturing of Chinese autos in Mexico is one that I think has been exaggerated, right? Chinese OEMs actually setting up and operating and producing vehicles. A lot of those announcements were just that. They were announcements, and they have yet to materialize, and they likely will not materialize because there have been so many restrictions placed on the exportation of autos, Chinese autos, right? Even if they are compliant with USMCA regulations to the United States, that it makes it not a feasible venture. So at this juncture, I mean, by our calculations, there are 7, right, total Chinese OEMs operating in Mexico, and mostly are doing so through the establishment of dealerships and strategic partnerships across the country. So leasing a facility in collaboration with a Mexican partner, for instance, to produce there. And then the 4, or I mean, actually, most of those 7 are just creating showrooms and things like that to actually sell the vehicles. There are 4 that are actually producing vehicles in Mexico, and those in general tend to be narrowly focused on basic assembly. So relying heavily on imports from China for vehicle components. So you have this basic assembly model fed by imports of Chinese parts, kits, vehicles, that ensures really that most jobs and overall economic benefit, frankly, stay in China, and the basic assembly happens there and then is sold. These cars are sold in Mexico and presumably extended to, these sales could be extended to Central America or elsewhere. The other story, right, is one of parts, right? And this is really where you see the big numbers. They have established these parts companies, Chinese auto parts companies have established in Mexico for a number of years. Now, this is not an entirely new story, right? But have done so at an accelerated pace since about 2012 by our calculations. And so far, accounting also for discrepancies in public data on Mexico's inward FDI, the Chinese parts manufacturers have played a much more prominent role in the Mexican auto sector than Chinese car makers, whether in foreign direct investment or in trade. They are actually bringing more in terms of trade than even the auto assemblers or manufacturers that have established themselves. They rely exceedingly heavily, just like the OEMs, on imports from China. And Chinese auto parts companies in Mexico imported, by our calculations, about 2 billion in goods from China in 2024 alone. And then beyond this, right, is the trade story. And I think this is the real story, right? Especially when we look at the challenges that China is facing at this juncture. China, this is a critical, almost existential moment for China as it looks to continue to be able to grow at even moderate rates into the coming years. And at this point in time, it will need to consider continue relying heavily rather on trade, specifically exports of wide-ranging goods to increasingly the global south. And we see this play out really across industries and massive growth and exportation in all sectors, right? In the Latin American region, and Mexico is no exception. What we're seeing here really is an effort to invest in order to be able to facilitate exportation of wide-ranging products, right? This is the story. And so increasingly we see OEMs investing in a very limited capacity because it doesn't make sense otherwise, right? There's not the North American market to access, but to import kits. We see the parts companies investing often at the behest of US companies, frankly, coming to serve Tesla or others, right? And to export those products northward for the manufacture of finished cars, but also importing so much of the other intermediary components that are needed to make those parts, right? And then increasingly now we're seeing just wholesale exportation altogether, right, of cars and other auto parts and goods. So even foregoing the FDI. So this is a matter of a need to export at all costs. Now that the property bubble has burst, there are a few other mechanisms through which to ensure growth at this juncture. And we're going to continue seeing this, whether in the auto sector or other industries. There's little other option for China, and it's going to be a matter of Mexico and others grappling with this from a policy perspective.
Those are great points. And I'm also thinking about imports that are coming from China, but they are imported by Mexican companies or American companies. So there it gets more complicated, right?
Right, exactly, which is also an enormous part of the story. Absolutely, because obviously the price differential is driving all of this, and that's the case across industries as we see this process of involution driving down prices across domains and industries in China.
But also these products probably is easier that they end up in the US than if we are looking just at the Chinese supply chain.
That's right. You said these parts would be easier. Yeah, right. I mean, and so there's plenty of exportation there as well, to the extent that there isn't. It depends largely on the good, right? And the tariffs that Beatriz mentioned do impact some of these items, and so it's gonna be a matter of that's where it gets very complex, right? Is how these prices are shifting as new tariffs are applied, especially as concerns the steel sector.
Sergio, let me turn around the argument here, because we see what China needs to do, which is to export and sell all these products. But what does Mexico need to do? If Mexico needs 130 billions every year from from Chinese goods, a lot of them intermediate goods, can we say that China is now a critical part of Mexico's supply chain, that Mexico relies on China to be able to export and to grow its presence in the US?
Yes, that's a great question. Let me start probably first with what Mexico shouldn't do, which is I think in terms of this response to this Chinese dilemma. And as you all know, part of the idea of Plan Mexico, and that appears quite often in the documents, is to go for import substitution as a response. Yes. That is actually the worst idea, because that's equivalent to trade destruction, if you will. And I think that from the point of view of an economy as open as Mexico, the idea of not only substituting China or the US, doesn't matter, but sort of internalizing production at the local level would imply that we will be foregoing all the advantages of free trade. And in that regard, obviously, the optimal solution would be to go for free trade. That would be trade creation in all its magnitude, but certainly there are geopolitical realities that imply that we're going to have to experience some form of trade deviation and deal with the consequences of that in terms of welfare. And I think that in that regard, Margaret's study about the auto industry is very illuminating, because I think that if we want to sort of reduce the disadvantage of trade deviation, that should be accompanied by FDI, because that would probably be the way in which you can create an advantage. And in that regard, what we have seen, for example, in the terminal auto industry, according to what Margaret's study shows, is that we are essentially becoming a bit of an assembly thing. It's going back to the maquiladora model, and certainly that is not something that is going to be reflected in job creation, in increases in technological capabilities, and of course in terms of FDI in general. So from that point of view, I think that the most important thing is that we should aim at replicating the model that we saw in the first wave of the auto industry in Mexico, which of course brought a lot of technology transfer, brought a lot of jobs, and it was a much more successful story. And in that regard, I think that is a very important contrast. And obviously, it depends on each industry, but I think that we should look at it at the micro level in order to see how we can sort of leverage all these advantages.
So your argument is that Mexico actually should promote Chinese FDI in the country?
Well, that is a good question. The problem is that if the issue on the other side of the Pacific is overcapacity, having FDI would imply that we will be asking China to increase even further its productive capacity, which is why I think that what we have seen in terms of FDI patterns, Chinese FDI patterns into Mexico is very different from the rest of the region. What China needs is to enhance its capabilities in terms of natural resources, and that means probably mining, etc., not manufacturing. From what Margaret said, there is overcapacity in China in terms of manufacturing capacity. That means that probably, being pragmatic, we should be careful in terms of that overcapacity not displacing our own ability. I mean, that's the reason, for instance, why you can make a case on trade about dumping. And I know this is another hard word to use, but somehow I think that it's going to be, being more frequently heard in our trade discussions in this triangle that is China, the US, and Mexico, and of course Canada.
Yeah, and I'm gonna reserve a question regarding anti-dumping and also the tariffs that Mexico wants to pass against mainly Chinese imports. But first, Beatriz, you've been in these negotiations in the past as a government official. All these, what does it tell you? Does Mexico need a trade agreement or certain framework with China?
Mm-hmm. Well, the relationship with China has always been extremely complex, the economic relationship, and now more so, no? The conditions for having a free trade agreement with China have never been there. The private sector have always very adamantly opposed any possibility of doing a free trade agreement with China. We are the most important competitors in our domestic market and in international markets. And there's this perception in Mexico, and I think now it's a generalized perception that China has not played with the rules of the game, and that explains also the crisis that we are facing in the international trade order, in which the international community, I think, many basically realized that they were, there was not a sufficient collective effort to put China into order, while they were in the WTO. They at the same time were subsidizing heavily their domestic industry. It's calculated that 10 times as much as the OECD countries. And so, but for many years, everybody was apparently very happy, no? They were producing very cheaply in China, making good money. The companies were making good money. The consumers were benefiting from cheaper products, and that at the end of the day created a lot of distortions in trade and in the economies of the world, and economic disparities, and and over production in China, and many of the conditions that now explain why we are in a totally new situation and living a new international trade order. That's not what we want necessarily, because it's not an order in which rules prevail, but it's who has more power is imposing now the rules. And so we have to get, I think, the international community, our act together to try to accommodate all this, because it won't help if the US continues unilaterally imposing measures, or even if, as Sergio mentioned very appropriately, the possibility of having a customs union in terms of common tariffs in North America towards China. That won't resolve the problem, because if the rest of the world is still importing from China and producing with Chinese products, that will be a problem. And we also have a situation in which we are all dependent on Chinese technological products, and it won't be easy to decouple from China from one day to another. So I think that, and I coincide with Sergio, that we have to be very careful with policies that have to do with import substitution, which can create competitiveness problems, unnecessary protection. And we have to win the battle, I think, internationally, because we're the most competitive and not because we're the most protectionist. And I think that we have to try to accommodate all of this at the same time. And that's what we're all looking for, no? A new trade system that is based on rules, but that tackles all of these problems that we did not tackle in the past, and an economic model that addresses the economic disparities that we face and that are there, and that we will continue to have governments that are not necessarily taking the right decisions based on perhaps what is popular and not what is sound economics.
So let me, if I can summarize the three answers of you guys, I think the common theme here is that China has this overcapacity, this drive to export its excess production to the world, and Mexico is seeing this flood of Chinese products. The answer from the Mexican government this year has been to move toward protectionist policy, right? They imposed anti-dumping duties pretty strongly in certain products, and now Congress is debating these tariffs that could get to 50% for certain products, including autos. So I want to abuse of my power as moderator and ask you if you can answer for yes or no in this sense. Should Mexico go for these protectionist policies, even knowing that they will hurt domestic consumption and maybe drive up inflation, or should the country worry about protecting its industry? Margaret, you want to start?
Oh, brother. Well, look, I mean, there are a couple of reasons. Do I have to just say yes or no?
Yes, you can argue
Well,
after.
let me qualify.
If you want, you can qualify it after, but please, if you were Claudia Sheinbaum.
I mean, I'll say it this way. I mean, from a political perspective, right, which is part of the decision making that is happening, some of the measures taken make sense, right? Because obviously we are moving into this moment of USMCA negotiation, or at least that's been the rationale, right? And I think that although it's very complex, right, and there are wide-ranging effects, positive and negative potentially, right, of these decisions, that is a very big part of the calculus, and I think driving so much of the decision making. And so in that sense, I understand fully what's happening, right? On the other hand, and we can talk about the implications of all of this, right? Whether industrial policy of the sort proposed will even be effective in the current environment, and whether the negative externalities will outweigh everything else, right, is a really critical question. And I can't say yes or no on this one. It's too hard for me, but I'm sure the others can very careful, very well.
Okay, Sergio, you are a free trader at heart. Come on, yes or no? Secretary Ebrard comes to your office as president, and you say, okay, let's go for it, or let's care about free markets.
Yes, I'm a free trader. Absolutely, that's my scene, if you will. But I will take Margaret's idea that this is a different geopolitical situation, right? And
Okay.
from that point of view, I would argue in favor of a yes, predicated on geopolitical circumstances. The only reason why Mexico is not a BRIC and is not interested in being a BRIC is because we have a privileged postal code, if you will, in the sense that we can become part of the North American region. And we know that whether we like it or not, the Chinese-American rivalry will define the 21st century. And from the sort of a strategic point of view, we have to decide whether we want to be in North America or not. In a different, obviously less dramatic circumstances, we are confronted with the same situation that 9/11 signify, whether that would imply getting into a process of deeper economic integration or not. And I think that, when you see the sort of the short-term cost of this decision, but if you accompany that with the kind of agenda that Patrice was talking about in terms of how we enhance competitiveness together, I think this is a region that has, the most potential because we have demography and we have energy. And this is something that obviously from the point of view of China, in terms of demography in particular, it's a critical advantage in the medium term, but we just have to learn how to harness. So I would rather be arguing in favor of a more liberal regime rather than being out in the cold.
Great. Beatriz, yes or no to imposing these protections against Chinese products?
I would say that yes. I would say that yes, because we have to realize that there's these distortions and that they're not easily, they cannot be easily solved. And this can be an instrument that aligns its policies with the U.S., with Mexico's policy towards China with the U.S. But it has to be very careful and I think that the Mexican government is at this moment, I know because of my work and with clients, that it's being very open to hear the different companies with regard to, views with regard to the big list, of as was mentioned, of products that are in this list of 1,400, over 1,400 products. And so they're listening to either when the companies have concerns that that tariff will make them less competitive because they really need those inputs. And what they're doing, and they're being much more open and changing their policy too, is that they're reactivating different programs to import under special rules, like the rule of the rule regla octava, or the 8th rule, in which companies can import if they meet a series of requirements. They can import products without inputs without paying any tariff or taxes, and they can then re-export the product and to other markets, without having paid that those tariffs that will be in the list, that will most probably be in the list. So I would suggest to the companies to come close to the authorities and to make their case if they will be hurt by those tariffs, or also make the case if they're in a condition in which they're competing at disloyalty. There's no equal terms with imports coming from China, and that they need certain protection. And I would also encourage them to explore they have to move fast. There's a lot of uncertainty. When will these tariffs will be approved? There has been ambivalence, and I think that ambivalence has to do with China and U.S. talks on what will finally be the agreement, the settlement there, because Mexico wants to follow exactly what the U.S. does in terms of tariffs and investment policy. So, but I've heard from good sources from Congress that it could be approved by the 9th of December. And so I would suggest that companies move fast during these days to make their case. And it's funny because I had a meeting very recently with an official from the Ministry of Economy, and he says, we really sometimes are in this, in this dilemma because on the one hand, the U.S. government is putting a lot of pressure on Mexico to impose tariffs and to not import from China as it has done in the past, to impose this type of tariffs. And at the same time, U.S. companies are coming that produce in Mexico are knocking the door and saying, please do not impose this tariffs because we're being really hurt. So that is what we're experiencing. And just very fast, with regard to anti-dumping measures, I think that they're a very good instrument, that they should be used much more. There's a figure in the WTO in which there's dumping for third parties, in which Mexico could request dumping cases in the US or vice versa, so that if they're facing competition in the US from Chinese products, even though domestic producers in the US are not being hurt, they're not injured, that the US government could initiate cases to protect Mexico's exports. And this could be done regionally. And Mexico has, and this is also another advice for companies, Mexico has been very open in the last year to initiate cases against Chinese products. It has doubled the amount of cases that it has initiated this year with regard to last year. And it even has done it, the authorities have initiated investigations themselves, which is very rare. Usually it's the domestic industry that takes the case to the government, to the authorities, to initiate the investigations. But now that is also being done by the authorities. And so it's a good instrument. It's to use if it's used properly and according to the rules, and in order to tackle unfair trade. And I think that's a correct policy, and we will see more of that under also talks on how to do this under the USMCA revision.
You touch on a very good point, which is Mexico is doing all this, I would say, maybe picking up a fight with China, but at the same time, the US is doing its own negotiation with the Chinese authorities, and Mexico runs a risk of overdoing it, and then we'll have to see what happens from that negotiation. All that leads me to the elephant in the room, which is the USMCA revision or renegotiation, if we can call it, given the situation right now. Margaret, how you see this revision going, and this idea that the U.S. pressures Mexico to, soften its relationship with China? Isn't it very hypocrite in the sense that the U.S. couldn't solve its Chinese problem itself, so it kind of lectured the Mexican authorities about doing it here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it remains to be seen. There's an assumption, right? There's an operating assumption among this government, and I think others in Mexico that that indeed by taking these measures that there is risk reduction, right? As everyone moves into these negotiations. it will be very interesting to see whether that in fact is the case, whether these have much bearing, right, on, and I mean, and whether even the overall numbers have much bearing on the discussion, right? As we mentioned, there are things that are presumed to be happening that aren't happening on the ground. In other cases, we're seeing more movement into certain industries that are going to, cause problems for Mexico as it looks to compete globally. I mean, just to give you I mean, of the areas that have been prioritized, under Plan Mexico, at least originally, if you're talking pharma, agribusiness, semiconductors, automotive chemicals, right? These are the ones that are prioritized in the 15 5-year plan, right? I mean, China's on its way to making these the big exports going forth into, the global south in the coming years. So, and we'll be
Are you saying that
incentivizing
Plan
the
Mexico doesn't have a sense? Or
what'd you say? Good.
are you saying that Plan Mexico is on collision course with
I'm
China?
saying it's a heavy lift. I'm saying it's a really heavy lift because, I mean, as you said, it's difficult for anyone to compete. Europe, the US, right? Everybody is facing this prospect at this juncture, and it's across industries and increasingly across these emerging or high tech, or innovation related industries that Mexico has capacity in and is going to need not only I mean, to compete is really a very challenging thing at a moment when, these companies are there is such intense competition among these companies with China that it is driving down prices to the point where they are making no money. And how do you compete with that when prices are just, bottoming out across the board? And so, and then also be able to, to make things that make a profit and to even to potentially export if that's the case. So it's not that it's impossible, but it would be enormously challenging thing to do. And Beatriz has outlined, I think, a number of ways through North American cooperation and collaboration, right? And to think through this and to think through strategic supply chain development that can make some things happen in an effective way. But this is hard for everyone globally. It's not a particularly Mexican issue. And yeah, so I think the road ahead is a challenging one, but I think this is going to be the negotiation is going to be one based largely on perceptions, and it will be up to Mexico to, to demonstrate the effect of the policies it's undertaken already, right, and what commitments it has and is willing to make, right, moving forward.
Sergio, in your view, how you see the negotiation evolving? Do you expect a short, quick agreement? Do you expect maybe Trump to keep postponing it, abusing of this clause that allows the revision to be postponed every year?
Yeah, well, I think that there is a lot of moving parts currently. I would say, more optimistic about the outcome of the negotiations a couple of months ago. And I think that in that regard, the China issue is something that can be used in a positive sense. I see the trade interests of the U.S. and Mexico vis-a-vis China align. And obviously, in that regard, and has to do with what Margaret said, we can negotiate directly with China in the sense that obviously Mexico is, respects China a lot. It's a country that has achieved a lot, but we can negotiate as equal because in that regard, although we're a smaller country, nonetheless, we have a lot of trade experience. We're not a closed economy anymore. We have all these teams, Beatriz is a very good example of the kind of people that are specialized on trade in Mexico. So I see that as a positive thing that we can use for the negotiation of NAFTA, of USMCA, sorry. The things that worry me the most have to do with the internal agenda of Mexico, and they have to do with, for instance, the judiciary reform, the role that Pemex and CFE has been playing in terms of having privileges from the point of view of U.S. companies. I think those are the issues that are going to be making the negotiation more complex when we think about the negotiation proper, and then the context that we cannot anymore think that we are going to be able to isolate a trade negotiation from other issues in the bilateral agenda. So they're going all to be mixed there, including security, including migration. And I think that in that regard, it's going to be a very complex process. I think that probably we're not, I don't see this as something that is going to be solved out of a negotiation and then we can just continue with business as usual. I think that the bilateral relationship is going to continue to be a critical aspect of the way that we conduct policy in Mexico for many years in the future. So I don't think that we're going to have a settled solution, as a consequence of the USMCA.
And Beatriz, in your case, how you see it evolving, and do you think we're gonna have a deal next year?
Yes, what I see is that, and there has been a lot of discussion whether it is going to be a revision or a renegotiation. In terms of what the text says, no, it's not clear if it's just revising the functionality and the operation of the agreement or not. I think that discussion is really irrelevant because the parties have the possibility also under the agreement to modify the terms anytime. So I think that we're in fact under a situation where the agreement has already been unilaterally renegotiated because many of its most important terms have been violated. And so we have that situation, and I think that the issues are so complex that we are dealing with that they will necessarily need to be formalized and in the context of a renegotiation of the agreement, because there are things, one thing that we were told a month ago when Robert Lighthizer was in Mexico, he told us all that the tariffs are here to stay. And so perhaps we will see a situation in which we, instead of having zero tariffs and the total liberalization of the trade in goods, we will have the introduction of tariffs in the agreement. He gave us a clue with regard to perhaps there will be transition periods, but the inversely, because we started in the NAFTA negotiations, we started with tariffs and then phase out periods in which we ended with zero tariff. Perhaps here we start with zero tariff and those goods that we cannot, that we depend on our trade, and then we will end up at the end of the day with certain tariffs. I don't know, it's really crazy, but we will see a movement in tariffs. We will see a movement in rules of origin, introducing new concepts such as the origin of investment, and perhaps stricter rules of origin also to avoid the use of inputs from China. We will hopefully see, that would be very good for Mexico to see subsidies, an agreement on subsidies, since the US has much more money to put in its industrial policy than us. And so I see, even though in the World Trade Organization, they're generally prohibited, we're in an era where everybody is applying an industrial policy, and we will want to align that with the US. And so there are many, the use of critical materials, exploding those together, it's energy security, which for Mexico is important, and also, integrating further the energy sector and addressing what's happening to the state-owned enterprises will be very important. Having a rapid response mechanisms and to agilize the dispute settlement mechanisms. Now that I think there will be much more recurrence to them, given the problem with the judicial reform, that this will not longer be an alternative for U.S. companies to address problems that they're facing in the Mexican market. So there are many issues that are there in the table, and that they're not easily resolvable outside of the agreement. So it can be an opportunity to deepen the agreement and to further integration, but there are a lot of risks involved, I think, given the perspective of how the U.S. is looking at North American integration. There's not a common vision, as there was when NAFTA was negotiated, where the problem was what happened internally, the opposition of domestic constituencies was a great challenge. Nowadays, it's not. We really do have to convince Canada and Mexico that we have to convince the US that we're the solution for addressing China and not the problem. And that will be a difficult thing to do at this time.
That's a fantastic point, because I think that summarizes very well the situation we are now here in Mexico. I think if you ask anyone involved, any business leader or politician, they will tell you that USMCA is the geopolitical future of Mexico. There is no doubt that I see the government, everybody's 100% aligned. They would love to have the same reaction from Washington, and I think that's what makes it much more complicated. We are entering in the last part of this session. We have only 15 minutes left. And I also have another question, yes or no, if to put you on the spotlight. And this has to do with a topic that I've been obsessing for a while now, which is BYD, the largest EV producer in the world. Last year, it seemed that BYD was ready to start a factory here in Mexico. Then Claudia Sheinbaum arrived to government. She said this plan, is not going ahead. Sort of like laying out and saying that investment wasn't welcomed. Margaret, yes or no? Would you allow or welcome BYD to have a factory producing their cars here if they want to, given the geopolitical considerations and the problems that this will create with the US?
I think if I were the Mexican government at this juncture, it's not a wise move, right? Ahead of this.
Not a wise
well, not a wise move. On the other hand, let me say, if I were a BYD executive, neither would I do so. I mean, it makes very little commercial sense that if you are unable to access the North American market, that's the sole purpose. So that aside, stick with Brazil, right, which is where they've established. And then this is why you see this trend toward just more exportation in general, right, directly from China, rather than investment to produce and then export to local markets, or not export, but to sell to local markets rather. So it's there's a rethinking in general on the part of EV companies, right, about what's the best way to do this. Is it market seeking investment, or is it just direct exportation? And so I think BYD too is recalculating. Not to mention that a lot of the EV sector is not going to be supported according to the 15th five-year plan in the same way that some of the other top priority industries, right, are going to be supported in the coming years. There's been this determination because there are tremendous fears about overcapacity in the way that we've seen in the solar industry. So a lot of thinking on both sides, right? It's sort of a mutual decision, I think, at this juncture.
Sergio, you mentioned before at the beginning that you will welcome more FDI from China. Is BYD's investment a good idea?
Yeah, you're all posing very difficult questions, Juan Pablo.
Don't think that I'm posting this to put you on the spotlight. I am, but I also wrote about it. So if you want to know my opinion, it's written this year. You can get my thoughts on this too.
All right, fair enough. No, listen, I think that one thing that it is true is that China has been advancing very rapidly on the learning curve of all technologies that have to do with climate change, and of course that includes solar panels, and of course EVs. And I think that we should recognize that they move much faster than the US, so that's an advantage. So from that point of view, thinking of BYD in Mexico, if you are going to have access to this technology and this experience that they had, probably will be interesting. But if I look at Margaret's paper, I would have doubts on whether we are going to have the technology transfers that would sort of tilt the balance in favor of saying yes. On the other hand, I think that there is a national security element as well. Cars nowadays are full of sensors, and that's a lot of information in terms of mobility, which is obviously something, again, it's sort of a brand new world in which we have to think about realities that go beyond trade, beyond economics. And in this regard, thinking that a company will have information about mobility all over Mexico it's something that at least we have to ponder in terms of the decision. So if we're not going to have technology transfers and we're going to have sort of heightened sort of national security risk, I would say no.
No. And Beatriz, your view on this, and also Mexico did a lot to try to get automakers relocate here, even during your years in the administration. Is that point that Sergio makes about transfer of technology then happening? Is it real?
Yeah. No, I would say that there's two alternatives with regard to the policy vis-a-vis China. And I think that the US has to, what the US does, will set the stage for particularly Mexico. No, I think we're very dependent on what the US policy is with regard to investment in China. We want to mirror the US policies. No, if the US is open for investment, why shouldn't Mexico be open for Chinese investment as well? We all need investment. What I think has been a very important thing that Thomas Friedman has said recently is that there's two postures. The one that has been adopted now, today, which is declaring the war to China in a way, although there's apparently new talks, and because we cannot decouple from China that easily in those technological goods, but declaring the war and say we're going to create our own bloc with allies, and then we leave out the others and see how we can survive, as soon as possible without China. No, that is one strategy. What Thomas Friedman says, no, why don't we welcome investment, Chinese investment, but under the same terms that, and we establish the same terms that China set when the American companies were investing in China. The exactly same policies. We do not have to be very imaginative. We, in terms of what you're saying right now, transfer of technology, having joint ventures, having local labor, no, not importing even the workers, having inputs, the whole value chain being done in the place where they establish their investment, and not, as Margaret has mentioned, no, that they import, or they source everything from their country. Having these very strict rules and surveillance of how they're doing their investment in the country, I think that would be a wiser policy when we need all of the development of technology that China has done and advanced in key areas, like, as it was mentioned, that have to do with also climate change and EV vehicle, and all of these sustainable goods that are important, and then recognizing the fact that we are dependent also on the raw materials, no, and we will be for certain amount of years still.
Okay, so we are left with 7 minutes. How about I give you 2 minutes each for closing remarks, and then we end. Margaret?
Apologies, fixing my audio. So, I think, what I would say, and I think this is one of the points that I've been trying to make throughout, is that this whole thing is very much co-produced, right? It's co-produced by the US and Mexico, and the points that you've made, Juan Pablo, and that Beatriz has made about, about the evolving US-China dynamic and uncertainties about how that will evolve, and whether there will be some deal that enables more in the way of investment from China and the United States, and certain sectors in which, already the US and Mexico are engaging. These are all things we have to consider, and that's ever evolving, right? At the same time, it's being co-produced by China and Chinese policy. And so keeping a very close eye on that and its evolution, and it's evolving at an exceedingly rapid pace, right? As China looks to manage, asymmetries, vulnerabilities across industries, and keep, productivity high, and keep the economy growing at even a moderate rate, is something that will need to be monitored very carefully rather. And so, what industries are the next ones to be prioritized beyond EVs, right? Beyond BYD, how will cattle fare, right? That's a Mexico question too. And so, in terms of battery production, for instance, and then all of these other sort of emerging industries that China's prioritizing at this juncture, wherein Mexico has some sort of some role to play domestically, globally, and in terms of the North American market. And so thinking through that and how Chinese policy intersects and how evolving Chinese policy intersects will be critically important. So let me just underscore the co-production of this relationship, and certainly that we have to keep the Chinese side very much in mind in terms of policy developments.
Thank you, Margaret. Sergio?
Yes, I think that there's, China is a reality of the 21st century, and no country can afford not to have a China policy. I am convinced in that regard that for the US, Canada, and Mexico, we are better off if we sort of collaborate and cooperate in terms of having a common China policy. Obviously, the current circumstances are not the optimal, in the sense that I think that we are sort of wasting some potential that we have in order to have a better ability to respond to this China challenge and to make the most out of it. So in that regard, I think that, the world is not ideal, and, we have a strong instinct, and you already mentioned it. We are going to stick together in North America, and probably hope for that at some point the winds change and we move towards a more liberal trade regime in North America. That is actually something interesting when you think about the coming USMCA revision or renegotiation. That probably, I would probably think about dragging my feet a bit, just to see what is the outcome of politics in the U.S. and whether the winds change at some point in favor of a more liberal attitude towards trade. But what is certain is that we should stick together in the region. This is our region.
Great, and that's a very good point regarding the domestic politics in the U.S. as we saw last week, and how that affects Trump's policy towards the region. Beatriz, your final remarks?
Yes, I would like to underscore the importance of companies being the private sector being involved at this moment, because they are the ones that they are the economic actors and the central in this, no? And whatever policies are taken domestically, and whatever is negotiated in the North America has is of their major concern. And they are the ones that have the credibility and the legitimacy, particularly US companies, to come forward to their government and to explain to them, not us, not Mexico, to explain to them why Mexico is so important and so critical for their production and for their competitiveness. And I think it's time also for the industrial sectors of the three countries to come together and to make proposals that are constructive. And if they are trilateral, many times it's easier also to be approved during the negotiations. So there's a lot of homework to do. There's openness at least by Mexican authorities to receive also proposals. There's a consultation process that is taking place in the three countries. In the case of there's a formal process that just ended making submissions. It ended in the U.S. on the 3rd of November. It's ending in Mexico a couple of days from now. But it doesn't mean that the companies and the industrial sectors will not be able to provide advice and to be close to the process throughout. No, so what I would say is don't worry if you haven't submitted anything. There's no problem. There's still a lot of time to do it. I would suggest not a lot of time, but I would suggest they do it before July.
Hurry up.
And they hurry up and they bring up proposals before July. And I would like to end up just with a positive note. And this comes from meetings that I had, and I participated in the Investment Week of Mexico in New York, and there was a coincidence among the U.S. and Mexican investors, and they coincided that that things will not change, in terms of the geography will not change. It is there, it's permanent, despite any type of policy or a decree or whatever that politicians have. That Mexico has a great potential, and that was recognized even in this economic complexity index that came out this year recently, in which that measures diversification and complexity of exported goods that Mexico has. It was ranked 17th, close to the US and Canada, of 133 countries. We have skilled and young workforce, and we have a lot of experience participating in the very sophisticated production chains that have been created, and that cannot be easily substituted, in North America. So there's the conditions are there. We just have to make them more evident, and in the academia and think tanks like an Inter-American Dialogue that is so important, all the think tanks that produce very valuable information that will make the case. So I think there's a lot of homework to do in all of different sectors to make this.
Always good to end on a positive note. Thank you, Beatriz. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Sergio. I started this conversation saying that I thought Mexico was one of the biggest front in the US-China competition. And after this, I'm even more convinced about that. I'm leaving with your thought, Margaret, about the existential moment of China. We don't need to, we need to understand what China is doing to understand what's happening here. Sergio, really good point about working together on the USMCA. I think that's key. I think more cohesion in the three countries will lead us out of this situation now. And Beatriz, a great point also on how companies should get involved in the conversation. This is not just governments. The companies need to own up and be part of the process. So I want to thank you all. I want to remind that the dialogue will continue having these conversations about Mexico, about Asia and Latin America in coming weeks and months, especially as the USMCA is being revisioned or renegotiated, as you want. And thank you all. Happy Friday.
Yes. Goodbye. Thank you.